Welcome to the Science for Sport podcast, where we dive into stories and insights that drive peak performance. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind the science of success. Here's your host, Richard Graves.
Hello and welcome to the Science for Sport podcast with me, Richard Graves. In recent episodes, we've discussed various coaching methods, psychology, and the impact technology is having on modern day sport. But what about nutrition? It's something we're all aware of, but how aware are we really of the impact good nutrition in our diet can have in optimizing our performance? Equally, the detrimental effects of bad nutrition. Well, today's guest, Dan Richardson, is a nutritionist who's worked across top flight sport in cricket, rugby league and football. He has vast experience working with athletes from different sporting spheres. So, let's hear from him now.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Dan, it's great to have you on this episode. For those that aren't familiar with your story and history, just give them a little bit of your background.
A very, I suppose, brief synopsis. I originally studied at university to be a sports scientist. So I went off to university with kind of all arms open, I suppose, embracing all opportunities that might come my way and hoping that I'd land somewhere in and amongst the professional sports realm. I was previously a rugby player, a failed one at that, I suppose. I remember having a very distinct conversation with my dad when I was kind of 17, going on 18, ready to go to university. And I had an offer from a local club that was a semi-pro deal, I suppose, back in the day. I think it accumulated about £60 a week, or go off and study sports science at Durham University. And to be quite frank, as a Yorkshire guy my dad is, he said, "You're not good enough, son, to be a rugby player. Go and find yourself a career in sport." So that led me down the path of doing kind of sports science and all the different disciplines at my undergrad, which then led me on to move over to Manchester. And then I went on to go and study a sports nutrition master's degree, which was probably one of my most favourite, I suppose, fond memories of being at university and kind of trying to underpin nutrition, which, as we all know, is quite a grey area and a challenge to pick apart. And then from there, I've gone on to work with multiple different teams across various sports: football, rugby, netball, hockey. Still do a little bit of work as well with development athletes across university sites. So the Talented Athlete Support Scheme that runs with your kind of GB and national team athletes. So I keep my hand in a lot of different sports, but most days you'll find me kind of at Leeds United's training ground, working as their academy nutrition lead, supporting the under-9s all the way through to the under-21s. And then also in and around Leicestershire County Cricket, where I support their men's first team, and obviously all of the different formats that come with cricket.
Yeah, certainly some wide-ranging and varied experiences for sure. Now, when you just say nutrition, you don't need to be a professional athlete. You can be a sportsman of any level. We're all aware of nutrition. But certainly in the amateur level, being aware of the word and being aware of what it means and the implications are two entirely different things quite often. So just give us a brief oversight of why good nutrition, well-balanced nutrition, is important when it comes to sport.
Yeah, 100%. And I completely agree with you on what you're saying there in regards to, nutrition isn't exclusive to elite athletes. And, rightly so. I was, during my time at university, a personal trainer, and I actually used a lot of what I learned in my degrees from the nutrition and training aspect to actually support those individuals that are kind of weekend warriors, or competing in a 10K at Tatton Park or wherever it might be. And ultimately, nutrition is something that we all need to be somewhat well versed in, even if we're not sporty or athletic as well. And I think it boils down, I suppose, when we think of the physical aspect of nutrition, to two kind of key factors. One being pre, which is energy, and the other being post, which is recovery. Now, we could take that on face value and kind of leave it there, but I'm sure we'll dive a little bit deeper in today's kind of episode in regards to how that might manifest for specific populations and people in terms of what they need to do prior to activity to support the best performance, which might be in relation to stamina, speed, strength, potentially reaction times as well, where nutrition can really help out with harnessing skill. But then over the other side, from recovery, in terms of decreasing the risk of injury and any kind of immune response as well, and supporting general kind of health, especially in these winter months, making sure that you're staying free from illness, but also that supporting aspect of recovery of the muscles, joints and tendons. nutrition can do a huge job and play a pivotal part in supporting all those key aspects.
Yeah, some people listening or watching this podcast on our YouTube channel will have heard what you said there and probably questioned recovery. Everybody knows the importance of a good diet when you're preparing to train, be it to do a marathon, going to the weights gym, whatever it might be. But good nutrition is essential for good recovery as well. Expand on that for us.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately people always focus on the kind of the exciting part, the fueling up, or if you're somebody who is about to partake in a marathon or a long run, the carb loading and the excitement around loading up on energy is always the nice bit. But what people forget is that after we've completed an event or after we've finished some form of activity, we also want to support the body with its recovery. And, for most people after a marathon, it might be a pint and a pie in a pub. But, certainly as a nutritionist, I'd like to think I've got some tips and tricks up my sleeve to support you with the kind of overall recovery aspect. And, if we boil that down to kind of the elite athlete level, we're looking at back-to-back training days, back-to-back potential fixtures, certainly in an academy where a player might be stretched across, multiple squads and need to recover in a specific time frame to support overall recovery. Now, I know listeners of this podcast are obviously quite well versed in sport and science, but there's also someone here that potentially this might be a new concept, a new topic to them. And I think when we talk about recovery, we can't talk about recovery without talking about protein and the important role that protein plays in the growth, repair, and supporting and maintenance of our muscle mass and development of muscle mass. Now, I always say in any of the kind of educating talks that I do that if we pulled up a kind of meal wheel or a food plate to show how that plate should look, protein will sit on that plate and it won't be any larger. Unlike before activity, you'd opt towards having more carbohydrates. It doesn't necessarily mean we need more protein post-training because we know with muscle protein synthesis, which is a fancy way of saying the regeneration of our muscles following activity, that's a longitudinal kind of process that goes on all the way across the day. And ultimately, there's a threshold to that in regards to how much protein we can uptake. So if we're looking at that meal wheel on screen and we had, let's say, a segment of protein, that would have the little gold star next to it. That's arguably the most important part of our recovery. And rightly so, I'm in an academy classroom here. I could probably go and find a gold star somewhere to stick on that protein. But then over the other side, we have to consider where we're getting the rest of our nutrients from. And something that's not often known, even in the elite athlete world, let alone kind of recreational athletes, is that more fruit and veg is going to contribute better towards recovery than more protein because of the vitamin and mineral uptake that we can get from more fruit and veg, the decreased risk of any kind of injuries or tears to the muscles in future and subsequent events of activity, but also supporting our immune function. Now, if we've got a healthy body, that means it's going to be able to combat that recovery much more effective. So breaking down the muscles, yes, we need to rebuild them back up with protein, but what additional can we add to that? And of course, we still need the other macronutrients in there, which is our fats and our carbohydrates, but obviously a little bit less carbohydrates, but still enough to refuel the body to replace what we've lost for activity, and then fats to maintain good health and obviously provide a little bit of support when it comes to kind of that recovery aspect. But the main focus really for most people, whether you're an elite or recreational athlete, is to focus on our fruit and veg intake with a dash of protein in there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the role that fruit plays in recovery. I remember going back some years now, admittedly, when we'd turn up for pre-season rugby training. And the coach at the time would say, look, make sure if you have nothing else, have some liquid, some squash that had orange in it. Now, I'm not saying to everyone listening to this podcast, orange squash is the perfect way forward for recovery. I'm really not. But the point was, if it had some fruit in it, that would help. The principle is still the same, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, granted, maybe, like you say, orange squash might not be the best. I do very kind of vividly remember being a rugby player myself and getting fed oranges and Jaffa cakes at halftime and full time. And the coach is convincing us that the oranges would recover the muscles in that very short period of time at half time, ready to go again, but also provided a benefit of hydration because of the orange juices that were within that. There is some method in there because obviously we know that citrus fruits mainly contain a lot of vitamin C, which can be really beneficial for our immune function, our support. A lot of the things we do here at Leeds is around kind of keeping athletes highly available. And I think one of the big things and big assets to any athlete is their availability ultimately. If we can keep them available for longer periods of time and also reduce the risk of injury and illness, then, the chances of them going on and having a successful career, or for speaking of a recreational athlete, the chances of them completing their high rocks or their marathon prep or 10K is going to be much more successful because they're going to stay free from illness and injury. So yeah, the vitamin C, I suppose, in the orange juice to some extent would have been beneficial in the oranges, and maybe not so much the Jaffa cakes we were given as well at half time. But there was certainly method in the madness of what our coaches were probably telling us. And granted, probably in the infancy of nutrition when it wasn't as widely popular with the research kind of hitting mass market.
I've got to tell you, Dan, it convinced me at the time. I felt it worked. It may also explain why I never went anywhere in my career, and I'm now hosting this podcast. Let's break it down a little further then, because as we've said, different nutrients apply for different training methods and different sports. So if you are an endurance runner, for example, you are preparing to run a marathon, what is the important role that carbohydrates specifically play in training, in preparation, and being able to get you through it? If, like I say, you've got the London Marathon coming up in 2.5 months' time, there'll be plenty of people up and down the UK that are in the midst of full training now, getting ready for that event.
Yeah, absolutely. And over in the north, we've obviously got the Rob Burrow Marathon coming up in Leeds that I've amply signed up for, and somewhat regretted the decision, but I'm sure it'll be
You're going to have to follow your own advice for this.
Yeah, that's the one. I'm going to have to start practicing what I preach instead of what's the other saying, do as I say, not as I do scenario. But yeah, there's a few of us in the office that are opting towards doing it. So we're kind of pushing each other on. We've got, obviously in our office, we've got physios and strength and conditioning coaches as well. So I think we're all just playing to our own strengths of supporting each other and almost having a mini multidisciplinary team around the marathon prep and periodization of that. But from a nutrition perspective, specifically for those that are running, I think carbohydrates can only get us so far, especially in long distance events like marathons, because we can go off a kind of a gram basis, but that's very individual in regards to the person, the athlete, how much uptake and storage they can have of carbohydrates. But typically speaking, any runs that are under kind of, or between the 60 to 90 minute mark, we'll use our glycogen stores, our carbohydrates that we're putting in our body to fuel that run. Now, granted, during that period of time, we might top that up with some liquid energy, potentially through a gel or a Lucozade, or if we can stomach it, we might be looking to chew on, specific kind of baked bars and things like that will be a little bit quicker absorbing and digesting. That'll help us to be able to get through those runs. But the real challenge comes when you're running a longer distance. And my, I suppose, background working with elite endurance athletes at a top level is fairly limited. I've done, a little bit of work in that industry, but I think from a running perspective, it's about looking towards storing and holding energy, but then also supporting the ability to be able to continue to put energy in the body. If we look at some of the top level athletes, they'll be putting, a minimum of 60 grams of carbs in the body on, let's say, a Tour de France, event that's quite long in duration. They'll be putting 60 grams of carbs in the body every single hour. Now that takes a lot of gut training and a lot of support. So I imagine for the most of us on this, listening or watching today's podcast, probably thinking that's definitely not for me. But some of the key tips that we can look to do is the build up towards the specific event or the run. So how does our pre-run meal look? Is the plate made up of 50% carbohydrates or potentially even a little bit more to really top up those stores? Are we eating that final meal at least 3 hours before to allow for digestion and the metabolization of that food so that it's ready to use as energy? The amount of times I work with recreational athletes who will quite literally eat their Weetabix first thing in the morning and then go on the run 20 minutes later and wonder why they're getting stitches and cramps and feeling low energy. And it's arguably because they've not had enough time to let that food completely move into the right areas of the body to support the energy systems that are at play during that run. So for me, I think the key is that pre kind of training or pre-marathon meal being, a good adequate amount of time beforehand, loaded with plenty of carbohydrates. And then, of course, we can look to the subsequent days of an individual preparation phase in terms of building up the carb stores slowly across those days, whilst also contributing a little bit towards our fats intake, because we know that after 90 minutes, once we start hitting that threshold of using the majority of our glycogen stores, our kind of fat storage will come into play to kind of support the energy systems, a little bit like a hybrid car. We have our main petrol tank, our carbohydrates, and then we have that kind of little battery of fats that will almost come into play when we're going uphill and we're struggling or we're getting towards that phase of the marathon or run that's a little bit tougher.
A few years ago, I had a friend who was working out in Qatar, and he decided that he was going to do a coast-to-coast run. For anybody that knows the geography of Qatar, it can be fairly slender in places. I think it was about 40k. And he'd been training for it. He'd got his shakes ready and had done a lot of work ahead of it. About a week, 2 weeks before he actually went on the run, he changed the composition of that energy drink, that shake, and only really started using it a couple of days before and then on the run. About 3/4 of the way through the run, his body just gave up, stopped. Yep. The point of raising that is how much do we need to be aware of our own body, what we're putting into it, and the importance when it comes to actually taking on a challenge of making sure we have, as you say, enough energy to not only be able to see the challenge through, but then recover adequately after it.
Yeah, I think ultimately there's two factors at play, and likewise, your friend probably experienced one of those. The first one is obviously if we're not conscious or thinking about our nutrition and our choices that we make when we take on board a large fitness challenge, then there's going to be a consequence to our energy availability, because likelihood is our expenditure is going to increase with the training load that we're putting through and into the body without increasing our energy intake. So quite simply, calories in versus calories out, without kind of putting it in real layman's terms. But ultimately, our energy expenditure will always exist because we have our basal metabolic rate, so just our kind of bodily functions. Then we've got our kind of non-planned activity, which makes up a small percentage of or the majority percentage, of our overall kind of active energy. So that's walking, talking, moving around, ultimately our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT as it's known as. Then above that, you've got your TEF, which is our thermic effect of food. So when we eat food, we burn energy. And then finally at the top, you've got EAT, which is our exercise activity thermogenesis. Now, that bracket expands when we take on a challenge, as in it doesn't necessarily mean that it takes up more of our percentage of total daily energy expenditure, but actually our total daily energy expenditure increases due to the volume of training. And if we're not reflecting that in our foods and the choices that we make with the meals that we consume, we're going to find ourselves in a deficit quite quickly. Or the second part of what your friend running the kind of coast to coast may have experienced is something which happens a lot with athletes that potentially move clubs or move squads, and suddenly there's a new exciting supplement that all of those athletes are taking, or there's a new meal that everybody's having before the kind of game. We've got, I've worked with first team players who still eat, beans on toast with scrambled egg because that's what they had when they were 14 years old. And if it works, if it don't fix it if it's not broken. Or ultimately, then they go to another club and suddenly it's katsu chicken curry, or it's something quite fancy beforehand, and then they decide to eat that. And actually it plays havoc with the stomach, because the stomach was expecting kind of a simple kind of breakdown of a food, not some fancy sauces, spices, etc. So what may have happened with your friend was changing the composition of that shake that he was having before the run, actually having it too close towards the kind of the event itself, meaning the body didn't have time to adapt to the kind of the new format of that shake, which might have resulted in less uptake of energy, but also struggling to kind of absorb that because it's unfamiliar and it's kind of uncharted territory that he was going into, and then throwing an event on top of that is always going to be challenging.
Yeah, latterly he did take on the challenge again and completed it second time around. So relief all round, I think it's fairly safe to say. But what you touched upon there, supplements. For the casual athlete, sports fan, you can go down the high street and there'll be protein supplements, there'll be creatine, there'll be electrolytes. How do we know what's right and what's wrong? Because they're all in flashy packaging, they all look appealing, and whatever platform you're on, social media, TV, radio, we're living in a current age and era when being healthy is all the rage. But not necessarily does that come with the correct packaging on it, in the sense of the right information and knowledge.
Absolutely, and I think you've hit the nail on the head, Richard, in terms of that. It's always the bright, glamorous packaging that pulls people into supplements, and I think ultimately we're in an era as well of quick fix. What can we do that's ultimately going to make the quickest percentage change to support our goals that we're trying to achieve? And don't get me wrong, in most senses of that word, that's kind of really kind of screams true, and it is a positive message to send out, is that yes, we want to achieve goals quicker, and we want to spend less time under tension and kind of move on to the next goal. But ultimately, supplements aren't really there to do that. And I think a lot of people do look at supplements as a bit of a cheat code, or something that we can use to enhance our overall ability to perform, or our health and well-being. And I think, yes, in a lot of supplement stores, there'll be bright, fancy packaging. And I think sometimes the more dull the packaging, the better the supplement actually is sometimes, in regards to, you look at some of the more popular brands in the sports world, they don't, glamorize their supplements or try and sell them to audiences that don't necessarily need them. I think for looking from a recreational athlete point of view, from a supplement perspective, there's a couple that I could probably pick out that I think would be beneficial in kind of the whole scale, and explain as to why they ultimately might be beneficial as well. And there was a brilliant paper done a few years back. I know Graham Close was one of the authors on the paper, called Food First but Not Food Only. And it was kind of a rethink for nutritionists, that we all talk about this food first approach. I think every single interview I've ever been to, I've probably used that word as a bit of nutrition bingo. Can I get the word food first in? But actually, not food only is quite important aspect of that sentence, because the most glaringly obvious one is vitamin D. Vitamin D, of course, we know 80% of that is absorbed through sunlight, and we're fortunate that we live in the UK where we get little to no sunlight across the winter months. So most of the UK population will find themselves in a vitamin D deficiency during that period of time. Apart from mushrooms growing under UV light, eggs and some fortified juices, potentially we're going to struggle to be able to absorb vitamin D. And again, that will only contribute to about 20% of what we actually need. Now, lack of vitamin D can potentially cause stresses to the bone, but also impact our immune function as well. So that's why it's quite important from a health aspect and an athlete aspect, I suppose, to be consuming regular vitamin D and supporting the uptake of that. Now, of course, that's kind of a very easy kind of health-based one to tick the box with and say that's going to be an easy one. You mentioned earlier, like electrolytes, creatine, and the likes, I suppose, protein. Now, creatine gets a lot of bad rap because there was a couple of I suppose, Mum's Net style magazines that went out years ago when I was first kind of studying it, around kind of hair loss and creatine and the impacts of it. And ultimately, that was done on a longitudinal study where they assessed the kind of observation of those taking creatine in, I think it was rugby players. And as you were saying, you played rugby when you were younger, like myself, and the age group they chose, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but it was between kind of 20 and 27, let's say. And what they found was, over that longitudinal study, that those males were losing their hair. Now, I've got a lot of friends at that age, as I am 27, and I can say that I'm doing quite well with my head of hair right now, and a lot of them have lost their hair, but that wasn't due to creatine, that's due to
there'll be a lot of people listening that can sympathise with this and say, yeah, I'm in that boat.
Yeah, and ultimately that's where that kind of grew, and it grew legs, and it gave kind of parents, I suppose, a bit of an angle to go after their younger athletes as to why they shouldn't take it. It also got compared at some point to steroids. I remember my parents saying that I shouldn't be taking it because it's due to steroids. Ultimately, creatine is a naturally sourced supplement, and we can get it through our nutrition, but we just can't get the volumes that we require to be able to elicit the kind of positive effects that we get on the muscles from that. Hence why we supplement it. I think I read a stat a few weeks back on Instagram. I know it's not the most reliable source, but ultimately it was, I think it was 2.5 kilograms of salmon would be equivalent to a single scoop of 5 grams of creatine. And realistically, nobody's going to be eating 2.5 kilograms of salmon every day to hit that scoop of creatine. So for looking for, kind of improving performance markers and increasing, muscle mass, then creatine might be beneficial, but the training has to match that as well. It can't be something that we just take flippantly whenever we want. We have to have a good training program to go with it and be consistent with taking it, because what we're trying to do is build up our creatine stores in the muscles. And the final one I think you mentioned as well was electrolytes. Now, you'll see kind of a lot coming out in the research at the minute around coffee in the first 90 minutes of waking is not good for us, and that we should have some salt water, which is absolutely true, because that's going to benefit us more from a hydration perspective of replacing any of the salts that are lost through sweating during sleep. Similarly with athletes, what we're finding, and also recreational athletes, is that electrolytes are becoming more increasingly popular, but actually more beneficial the more we look into the research. So if you're able to, increase your water intake as you would to be specific around your training and your sweat rates, but then also include an extra electrolyte in there for fluid balance, then ultimately that's going to benefit us in regards to once we get to the kind of end of the session, not being, heavily dehydrated or heavily negative in our fluid balance, because what we'll have done prior to the session is topped up those stores. So as we start to sweat, it doesn't necessarily cause as big a problem as what we might first thought. So I'd say those three are relatively safe supplements to use and can be used across the spectrum of kind of non-elite and elite athletes as well, and arguably have a rationale for both spaces. Whereas there's others that, are quite high level performance based supplements that we'd probably want to avoid, although they'll be packaged up to the mass market to say that they'll improve all kinds of different ailments and support in different performance markers and benefits. But realistically, it all starts with good nutrition, and then we add supplements to create that kind of overall holistic approach to nutrition to support performance.
Yeah, and as you touched upon right at the top there, the key really is in the word supplements. They are supplements. There's no substitute for whole foods. So look, we're almost at the end of our session, Dan. So wrapping it up for this episode, at least, I'm sure we'll revisit this topic again in the future. What would your tips be generally for meal plannings around pre-workout and post-workout regimes?
Absolutely. I think, we touched upon at the start that pre and post, and we spoke about pre, probably after post. I think we started with post, but going in kind of linear order, speaking about pre, I think the importance is to have a presence of carb within that meal prior to a training session or a competition, at least 3 hours before, in making sure that we've got enough time to digest those foods. If we're thinking it on a meal wheel or a food plate, around 50% of our plate coming from carbohydrates to support the uptake of glycogen to support performance. During, we might look towards having some hydration benefits across there, but maybe pre, we'd stick towards those electrolytes to get them in the body early so that we can use them during that 60, 90-minute session, whatever it might be, but ultimately top it up with water during, and then post, as we've kind of debunked the myth of the more protein, the better recovery, ultimately stick to a typical portion of 20 to 40 grams of protein to elicit muscle protein synthesis, but then focusing really intently on that 50% of your plate being made up of fruit and veg ultimately. And I think if we can stick to that and kind of focus on, mapping out our plates in percentages, it's a really good place to start for any athlete or recreational athlete. And like you say, I'm sure we can build on this in future episodes and really dive into some of the key topics of nutrition.
Yeah, for sure, because as you've touched upon it across the different sporting spheres that you've worked, diets for rugby league players compared to cricketers, long distance runners compared to weightlifters, completely different things. And these are topics that there's certainly mileage in delving into in future episodes, no doubt. But we really appreciate your time for joining us on this edition of the Science for Sport podcast. And for those that are interested in reading more about your research and finding out about what you're getting up to and where can they find you?
I think the best place to find me is probably on Instagram, which is at DRN Nutrition. If not, just connect with me on LinkedIn. Always like a good chat about research on LinkedIn.
Certainly don't turn up that offer. Dan, thanks again for joining us and all the best, certainly with that Rob Borough Marathon in the coming months as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for having me on.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Many thanks to Dan Richardson. He's certainly left us with plenty of food for thought. I know what you're thinking. That was an awful pun, and I agree. But if you have enjoyed listening to his advice and sharing his thoughts on the subject of nutrition and want to find out more, then you can do so by going to our website, www.scienceforsport.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. Remember, the more downloads we get, the easier it is for us to attract top-name athletes and experts at the very top of their field. Well, that is just about all for this edition. Until next time, when I look forward to talking to you some more on the next edition of the Science for Sport podcast.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.